let's start. Thank you very much, all of the participants. And first of all, thank you very much, Professor Jansen, for joining us today and for this opportunity to discuss your report on the coherence of the directive with other legislation, let's say sectoral legislation. Let me introduce you, the other member of this panel, and the other colleagues that are with us today. First of all, Begoña Fernandez, as you say hello before, from the City Council of Madrid, Professor Michele Cozio from University of Turin, and Professor Raquel Carvalho from University of the Católica Portuguesa. No? Thank you very much. I don't know, maybe if you want to start with a brief presentation about the objective of your study, and then we can go directly for the discussion, they ask the question, etc. Okay? Thank you very much.
Yes, that's totally fine. Can you hear me, Ximena, at the moment?
Perfectly.
All right,
Perfectly.
fantastic. Well, thank you so much, first of all, for this wonderful opportunity to discuss this report. I have very fond memories of my research visit at your university in Alcalá, and it's a pleasure to be able to discuss it today with you, because I think this is really a vital step in mostly in the implementation process, but also to consider if this is really the framework that will work in the future and if it will be effective. So maybe to give you a bit of background, and I'll be brief to leave plenty of space for the discussions. It's us procurement lawyers, we were very comfortable, I think, over the years with the public procurement directives and the national implementation. And what has happened now is that, particularly in light of the EU Green Deal, we've seen an influx of more than 60. I believe the 62nd has now been proposed last week, of sectoral pieces of legislation. And that concerns directives and regulations regulating green, social, cybersecurity, security of supply, circular economy, energy efficiency. So various strategic objectives on top of the creation of the internal market, which is the pursuit of the public procurement directives. And in light of the reform of the current procurement directives, right, we'll hopefully see new proposals for directives or perhaps even regulations, we don't know, by Q2, so say in the spring of 2026. And the study that I conducted and the question that the Commission posed to me was what to do with the relationship between the public procurement directives, our old context and still current context, and these new legislative instruments. And in my study, I found that, of course, this body has evolved, but I think one of the major conclusions is it was never evolved from a coherency perspective. It was very ad hoc. You see big legislative acts with one provision generally devoted to public procurement. And I think I've made a couple of recommendations, but let me highlight a few, and then I'll give the floor to the other speakers. I think what is absolutely vital is more awareness about this legal framework, but also to have a broader discussion about what these legislative acts actually should do. So what should the procurement directives do and what should these legislative acts do? Because in general, I think it's clear that we're moving from how to buy to what to buy. But how they do that is very mixed. We see targets, we see specific technical specifications, award criteria, contract performance conditions. So it's, to be honest, amongst all of us, a bit all over the place, right? And it's often not clear why a specific focus has been taken. So what I've argued for is more coherency, more consistency amongst terminology, but also amongst the acts themselves. And what you see is that there's even conflict between them. So when you look at the corporate sustainability due diligence directives and the public procurement directives, it's, in my opinion, even impossible to apply both at the same time in a correct manner. Now, as a final point, I think a lot of it is also still unclear, because a lot of these legislative acts are based on delegated powers to the Commission. So the Commission is really, the ball is in their court. They would need to start enacting legislative instruments themselves. And you see the first ones coming out, right? We see circularity and technical specifications being adopted based on the Net Zero Industry Act. Say that wind turbines need to be 70%, a minimum of 70% needs to be recyclable. So that's a very clear way of where the Commission is heading. And finally, I think what this will require, and there's a lot more to say, is an omnibus. Is we will need to reform all of these legislative acts at the same time. And I know omnibus are not having the best reputation, particularly from an environmental perspective. They're now and I'm saying that as a euphemism, they're now being used to hollow out what I think are very good environmental standards in, say, reporting and due diligence legislation. But to be able to do this because of its grand scale and to really provide consistency, I do think we need a more broader approach than a single reform of the eco-design regulation or the energy efficiency directive. No, I think we should look at it all together from a very coherent perspective. There's much more to say, but I'm mostly interested to hear also what the rest of the group has to say about this. So if it's okay, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much, William. Bueno, voy a continuar ahora con la exposición y voy a hacer una primera pregunta antes. Espérate, voy a poner ahora. Sí, solamente quería compartir, a ver si soy capaz de compartir una... no. Bueno, tenía preparada un slide para decir que este es un seminario que analiza este trabajo que ha hecho Willem y que este trabajo es uno de 4 o 5 que ha encargado la Comisión Europea para preparar el proceso de evaluación que hace un mes tuvimos a Roberto Caranta explicando, digamos, otro de los estudios también relacionados con la coherencia. Bueno, como he explicado, bueno, luego si podemos, proyecto eso simplemente para que nadie se pierda por qué estamos hoy reunidos aquí. Bueno, por supuesto, felicitamos a Willem por su estupendo trabajo que abre tantas ideas. Bueno, lo primero que me gustaría decir es que efectivamente el trabajo de Willem pone, ¿no?, sobre la mesa la comparación, la relación entre la legislación de contratos y la legislación sectorial. Este es el slide al que me refería anteriormente. Y gracias, María. Y entonces... quiero decir que no es una cuestión nueva que la legislación que vamos a denominar sectorial establezca obligaciones, sobre todo ambientales, ¿no?, que tienen una incidencia directa en los contratos públicos. Esto ha pasado siempre, ¿no? Y ha pasado a nivel europeo y ha pasado a nivel interno. Lo que pasa es que antes, por simplificar mucho las cosas, o en un periodo anterior, pues estas obligaciones las teníamos localizadas, eran más puntuales, estaban más aisladas. Pero efectivamente con la utilización de la contratación pública para finalidades de descarbonización y de protección de la biodiversidad, etcétera, etcétera, entonces hemos tenido que cambiar de arriba abajo toda la legislación y la manera en que nosotros hacemos las cosas. Y esto ha traído como consecuencia que ahora ya no las tenemos perimetradas estas obligaciones, sino que, como he escrito en un trabajo, como que la legislación sectorial ha tomado el control, ¿no?, un poco de la... Entonces, y ahora no son unas, sino que son muchísimas, y el trabajo de Willem nos da como una especie de muestra enorme un análisis de esta legislación sectorial entre sí y la legislación sectorial con la legislación contractual, mostrando las distintas, por decirlo de alguna manera, patologías, ¿no? En la manera en que se ha legislado y cuáles son los problemas de incoherencia. Entonces, bueno, yo lo que le quería preguntar en primer lugar a Willem era no tanto por qué ha pasado esto, ni cuáles son esas patologías que describe también, sino que fuéramos directamente al tema de las soluciones. Es decir, cómo vamos a abordar, ¿no? Estas incoherencias, tanto desde el punto de vista de la regulación que existe, la dejamos donde está, la metemos en las directivas, qué parte iría en las directivas, qué parte quedaría en la legislación sectorial, porque, y con esto ya termino, porque por otra parte esto es efectivamente una preocupación general. El informe del Tribunal de Cuentas que todos tenemos en la cabeza subraya este aspecto y dice, oye, esto es un desorden, ¿no? Pues esto hay que sistematizarlo. Parece que se nos ha ido un poco la mano legislando de esta manera. El Parlamento Europeo el 9 de septiembre pasado también ha insistido en lo mismo y también creo que estas reflexiones nos vienen bien como en el ámbito interno, porque esto que se ha descrito a nivel europeo es exactamente lo mismo que pasa a nivel interno, donde tenemos también una legislación sectorial desatadísima, ¿no? En múltiples sectores y no sistematizada ni coherente. Willem.
Thank you so much for your remarks. I think maybe two reflections in response to what you very eloquently pointed out. I think there's first off why this is all happening. I think there's two reasons, right? In English, you say let's kill two birds with one stone, right? In the Netherlands, we kill two flies with one smack. Don't know what you do in Spain, but it's like it's a very similar thing. I think in Russian you kill two pigeons with one rock. Exactly the same. So the environmental rights organization PETA has suggested is that we don't say to kill two birds with one stone, but we feed two birds with one scone, right? To make it a bit more environmentally friendly. So I think that's the starting point, right? Is that the procurement is seen as a lever to effectuate change in society. However, I think the starting point of much of the legislation also coming out of the European Green Deal was because the Commission was of the opinion that it wasn't happening enough. So we weren't feeding enough birds with those scones. We weren't using procurement enough to create sustainable and social outcomes. So I think a lot of those more what to buy requirements, mandatory requirement, at least the conclusion that it did happen. Now we're at an issue though, and that's I think maybe also part of the discussion here, is that when you look at what the Court of Auditors concluded and what a lot of studies are indicating now as well, is that there's at least in many member states or in some of them insufficient competition for public procurement. Now, if you look at many markets and what I think, even though social and green objectives, just to use that as an example, they're very noble and very useful approaches. But what happens then in the market and what you're actually trying to do to a market is that you narrow the scope of who can bid for a contract. So there seems to be some friction there of the objectives we're trying to achieve. On the one hand, we're reforming the public procurement directives to make Europe more competitive or to create more competition. And on the other hand, we're still trying to spur innovation and green and social growth. So I think there could be conflict there. And I think the point also where we're at, and I think you rightly put you hit the nail on the head. I think when it comes to the question that we're faced is, what is the actual role of the public procurement directives and what is the role of these sectoral pieces of legislation? And my colleague Roberto Caranta, who you previously had here on this webinar series, he worked on a different report, more on coherence between the public procurement directives. We're now working on an opinion also for the Commission to also think ahead. And I think one of the things that we're sort of thinking about is, if sectoral legislation should be one, purely about what to buy, right? And secondly, I think there should be more consistency in how they regulate that, right? I think it would be very useful to consider sectoral legislation, and in future reforms is to perhaps only focus on technical specifications. And I think the advantage of that would be is that the procurement directives remain procedural, based on the public procurement principles, equality, transparency, non-discrimination, proportionality, and that the sectoral pieces of legislation should be minimum harmonization. So a bottom line, Europe regulates the minimum, say based on technical specification, and that would allow the member states or more active contracting authorities to go beyond that. Right? I know there's quite a lot of activity in Spain through the work that I've done with your center, also on regulating sustainability in public procurement in the variety of acts that you have on local, regional, and national level. And I think that's at least the first step, is to be, let's be clear and say the procurement directives do this. They're focused on market integration and voluntary objectives. Whereas the sectoral pieces of legislation, they're perhaps mandatory, focusing on technical specifications. And I think the reason why that's important to do that is because otherwise we will keep having this web of rules that will continue to develop organically, but also very unclearly. So I think what would be useful is sort of like the Commission came up with this competitive compass, right? It said, well, this is our compass of the future. Well, maybe we need a procurement compass to say this is how we will legislate in the future, because otherwise I fear that these issues will just continue to grow, actually. Yeah.
Yo, thank you very much, William. O sea, yo entiendo esta división, ¿no? Es decir, dejamos esa parte en las directivas de contratación y dejamos technical specification en la legislación sectorial. Esa podría ser una división. El problema es que la legislación sectorial no siempre, últimamente, crea technical specification, sino que dice, pues, criterios de adjudicación, están, y claro, dice, bueno, a ver, ¿dónde te vas a quedar tú? ¿No? Porque es que esa división me parece lógica, por otra parte es la división tradicional que, digamos, que ha habido. Entonces, yo tengo mis dudas de cómo puede funcionar. Otra cosa que también creo que iba a mencionar Miquel, si le puedo dar la palabra a él, yo creo que también, o sea, una cosa es esto, es qué hacemos con las reglas, ¿no? Y otra cosa también es cómo regulamos, ¿no? Es decir, no sé si tendríamos que poner un control ex ante, ¿no? No sé, un poco, a ver, lo de due diligence, ¿no? Que ha pasado y que esto también lo hemos comentado, parece que tiene que ver con que a veces cuando se legisla, no desde los parámetros de la contratación, desde fuera, pues a veces no se conocen bien las consideraciones, ¿no? Y los parámetros y los criterios de contratación. Bueno, pues Begoña, ¿quieres intervenir tú ahora o
Sí, sin
cualquiera?
problema.
Vale.
Dile, muchas gracias por tu trabajo, para empezar. Has conseguido concatenar en un único informe multitud de directivas y reglamentos que inciden en contratación pública. Y yo, desde mi papel de una administración local, gestora pública, en donde pues llevo desde más del año 2003 con cláusulas ambientales en contratación pública, ya en ese momento nos preguntábamos la diferencia o la dicotomía entre la legislación contractual, que hablaba en el cómo comprar, y la legislación medioambiental, que hablaba del qué comprar. Esa dicotomía entre las especificaciones técnicas ambientales y los procesos, los diferentes procedimientos para contratar. Y estamos ahora mismo en una situación, en un punto de inflexión, desde mi punto de vista, en relación con el marco regulatorio europeo sobre contratación pública y todo lo que incide en la legislación medioambiental en contratación pública. Y lo digo porque prácticamente todas las nuevas legislaciones, directivas, reglamentos, actos delegados, se han dado cuenta de la poderosa palanca que es la contratación pública, y todos tienen al menos un articulito en donde se menciona el uso de la contratación pública como una herramienta para implementar esa política medioambiental. Eso nos ha quedado claro a todos los que gestionamos contratos públicos. Y sobre esa base nos damos cuenta de que los legisladores sectoriales o no conocen las reglas del juego de los diferentes instrumentos que se utilizan en contratación pública. El artículo 31 de la Directiva de Diligencia de Vida es un claro ejemplo, en donde, pues, considerando 97 de la Directiva 24, te dice que no se puede utilizar responsabilidad social corporativa como criterio de adjudicación. ¿Qué narices hace el artículo 31 de la Directiva de Diligencia de Vida metiendo criterio de adjudicación en un entorno de los informes de sostenibilidad de diligencia de vida de las grandes empresas? Eso crea una serie de inseguridades jurídicas que les has puesto de una manera meridianamente clara en tu informe. Pero para no irme por las ramas, ya teniendo en cuenta que comparto muchas de las reflexiones y recomendaciones que mencionas dentro de tu informe, a mí me interesaría específicamente el hablar de la vinculación con el objeto del contrato. Si tenemos, y contextualizo un poco, si tenemos esta famosa sentencia del asunto 360/2010, el de Países Bajos contra la Comisión Europea, también llamado el Max Avelar o el del café de comercio justo, que lo conocemos habitualmente, en donde amplía de una manera estratosférica el concepto de vinculación del objeto del contrato. Al fin y al cabo menciona, aunque no formen parte de su sustancia material, que es lo que nos ha permitido a los gestores incorporar criterios de adjudicación de carácter medioambiental dentro de nuestros pliegos sin que nos lo tumben los tribunales de recursos contractuales. Tú mencionas dentro de tu informe que la manera de poder introducir estos criterios de adjudicación para mejorar su permeabilidad en los contratos públicos es suprimir ese concepto de vinculación del objeto del contrato. La verdad es que me ha llamado poderosamente la atención, porque realmente la idea es brillante en el sentido de si puede ser cualquier tipo de criterio medioambiental o social como criterio de adjudicación, aunque no esté directamente vinculado al objeto del contrato, en sintonía con el espíritu de esta famosa sentencia del 2020, del asunto 368/2010, superaríamos todas las incongruencias que tenemos para ambientalizar nuestros pliegos de contratación. Y además, siendo un criterio de adjudicación, no tenemos este problema de falta de competencia. O sea, no es una especificación técnica de obligado cumplimiento que pone ante los pies de los caballos a los operadores económicos, sino que permite que el mercado vaya avanzando a los diferentes operadores económicos para que presenten sus ofertas cada vez más ambientalizadas.
Vale. Bego,
¿Cómo
perdona
lo
que te
ves?
corte. One minute, Willem. Es que cuando estás hablando no se te escucha bien.
A mí,
¿Sabes? Yo creo que Willem te ha entendido, pero parece que cuando te mueves te perdemos un
vale.
poco, ¿vale? Ok, gracias, Willem.
¿Has conseguido entender la pregunta, Pilen? ¿Cómo ves tú lo de suprimir la vinculación del objeto del contrato en los criterios de adjudicación?
Thank you so much. Maybe my Spanish is getting better, or maybe the question was just really good, or maybe the translation or the combination of all, but I got everything. So thank you so much for your rich reflection, which I think highlights some very important points. Maybe before I delve into the question of the relation to the contract, which I think is a very useful one, I think what's in a way tricky is that we've seen this avalanche of, or this tsunami, no matter what natural phenomenon you'd like to use, of sectoral pieces of legislation, because procurement is seen as a solution for everything. And I think, in a way, I don't mean to diminish that, because I do think procurement has a very important role to play. But I think what's an important question for the future, which I think you also relevantly highlight in your reflection, is how do we make sure that with the different objectives that contracting authorities will need to fulfill, already based on voluntary local procurement objectives, and now we have these legislative objectives related to circular economy, energy efficiency, how do we make sure that procurement stays effective, right? Is that all those goals will be achieved? And I think one of the issues here is that I think that particularly in Directorate of Environment in the Commission, there was just this wave of thoughts, which I think are useful, but very much in silos within the European Commission when these proposals came out, all taking up procurement as an instrument, but not looking at it coherently. And I think that's an issue. And I think that's also led to this conflict. And then I'll zoom in on the question that you posed between the corporate due diligence directive and the public procurement directives. And I think that's very much at the root cause of the issue that you're addressing here. So in the report, what I've tried to do is suggest solutions for that conflict, right? So on the one hand, we've got the corporate sustainability or due diligence directives noting, well, you can use compliance with the directive voluntarily or of entities falling under its scope as contract performance criteria or award criteria. Then when we look at the public procurement directives, it says in the recitals that you can't look at the general functioning of an entity, right? And that stems, amongst other things, from the case law that you refer to, but also to Concordia Bus from 2002, where the court said, well, there needs to be a link to the subject matter of the contract. And I think what's tricky is that also we've developed as in Europe, as society has developed. And I think there's a case to be made to say now, well, we need to look at the broader positioning of entities. When you look at the importance of, say, social enterprises or entities that offer more than just profit making, and also simply want to add back to society, that invest profits in societal objectives like sustainability, like local employment, I think there's much to be said to move away a bit, and I'm being a bit controversial here in the realms of procurement law, is to move away so much from focusing on the bid, but actually moving towards focusing more on the bidder. And traditionally speaking, why we struggle with that, I think, in procurement, and why we focus so much only on selection, is because we're afraid of discrimination, right? We're afraid that the internal market won't come about and will, discriminate those foreign entities. But I think if we look at what society needs right now, I think we need to reevaluate what's the most important objective right now. Is that the creation of the internal market, which unfortunately, after 50 years of public procurement legislation, is simply not there, right? We have a very low amount of interstate effect. So I think a reevaluation of the question, okay, this is what we actually need to focus on. And I think we could move more towards environmental objectives, more towards those entities that intrinsically take that to heart. And I think that also means that because of that, we can sort of look at ways of reforming the link to the subject matter of the contract. Now, in the report, because it's linked to that specific conflict between the public procurement directives and the corporate sustainability due diligence directive, that I think leads to a number of points, right? We could say, well, we'll allow for general policy related to the environment, but we still, in general, have the link to the subject matter in of the contract. So then it's like a carve out. It's a specific part that we say, okay, well, that's allowed. Or we say we get rid of it altogether. We say the link to the subject matter is actually something that we will not be working with in EU public procurement law anymore. And I think I don't have the answer yet, but I think at least there is some reason to reevaluate what's more important right now? Is it the internal market, which heavily also relies on the link to the subject matter of the contract? Or is it also environment and social and other objectives, which may require an evaluation of the bidder rather than only the bid? But I'll leave it at that. But thank you so much for your very rich reflections. That was very nice.
Thank you.
Willem, por tus palabras. Tengo una segunda cuestión antes de dejar paso a Michele. Otra de las conclusiones a las que llegas en relación con los motivos de exclusión me ha parecido especialmente relevante porque yo no era consciente, o sea, sí que sabía que existía el problema, pero no sabía que había tanta legislación europea que hacía referencia al artículo 57 de la directiva europea en relación con los motivos de exclusión. Y me ha parecido bastante llamativo que algunos consideren estos motivos de exclusión dentro de la licitación a modo de sanción, cuando en el ámbito de la legislación contractual se considera una medida preventiva para digamos, confirmar al poder adjudicador que ese licitador cumple con unos mínimos jurídicos, tributarios, sociales. Y me ha llamado precisamente la atención el hecho de que se hable tanto de este motivo de exclusión dentro de la legislación medioambiental y vuelva a ocurrir exactamente lo mismo que con el vínculo, con el objeto del contrato en los tipos de adjudicación. Voy a ser un poco borde, pero parece que los legisladores medioambientales no tienen ni idea de legislación contractual, y entonces incorporan los motivos de exclusión, que en el ámbito español los denominamos prohibiciones de contratar, porque les parece una buena idea un jus puniendi del operador económico que se porta mal, porque incumple la legislación medioambiental, la legislación social, los derechos sociolaborales, en fin, esa pléyade de sanciones que vienen en las diferentes legislaciones. El hecho de que tenga esta ausencia absoluta de coordinación y coherencia a la hora de redactar los motivos de exclusión nos pone a los gestores que tenemos que velar porque los operadores jurídicos que se presentan a nuestras licitaciones cumplan con las diferentes legislaciones, ya sean de carácter social o de carácter medioambiental, nos pone en una situación muy difícil porque prácticamente tenemos que ser unos Leonardo da Vinci de la legislación. O sea, tenemos que saber de derecho procesal, de derecho medioambiental, de derecho laboral, de derecho penal, del derecho... incluso tenemos que hacer algo que es actualmente meridianamente imposible, que es saber quién tiene una sanción en materia medioambiental, quién tiene una pena en carácter medioambiental o quién ha infringido, por ejemplo, la directiva del salario mínimo. Porque no hay ningún sitio en donde los gestores podamos localizar esa información. Esto también nos pasa en España. En España no podemos saber qué sentencias del Tribunal Supremo han impuesto a una determinada empresa una sanción grave relacionada o una pena grave relacionada con legislación medioambiental. De manera que sobre el papel queda muy bien, excluir al operador de las licitaciones, pero si la mesa de contratación no conoce ni tiene un sitio, digamos, un registro público accesible a nivel europeo de cuáles son las empresas que tienen estas prohibiciones de contratar, se convierte en papel mojado. Además, nos encontramos con que en algunas formulaciones, como la del reglamento de deforestación, mencionan 12 meses de prohibición de contratar. En la legislación de contratación habla de hasta 5 años. En algunas legislaciones hablan de procesos self-cleaning, en otras no vienen procesos self-cleaning. ¿No sería mejor, digamos, poner unas reglas en los motivos de exclusión en donde decir legislador penal, legislador medioambiental, legislador social europeo? Ten en cuenta que si quieres meter un motivo de exclusión, tiene que ser una medida preventiva o naturaleza preventiva, que tiene que tener un periodo temporal hasta 5 años, que tiene que figurar en la sanción o en la sentencia para que sea efectiva, porque si no te vas a un procedimiento administrativo bastante largo que puede terminar en los tribunales y puedes tardar 10 años en aplicar una
Bego,
prohibición de contratar. De manera que, ¿no crees que ese método para decirle a los legisladores, si metes una exclusión, motivo de exclusión, tienes que tener en cuenta estos parámetros para meterlo dentro de tus articulados?
vale, gracias, Bego.
Thank you so much for the second question. I think it's one of the points that are there's a difference, I think, which you rightly point out between on paper the systems can coexist, right? So on paper you could say we have exclusion grounds in 57 in the public procurement directives, mandatory, voluntary, and they work with reliability, more bit backward looking, but also forward looking for the future contractual relationship. Then we also have those in the sectoral pieces of legislation, which are incredibly inconsistent, as you rightly note, that are more punitive, so more sanction related. So they're penalties. And even though on paper those systems can coexist, I think one of the most important things now in the implementation phase is to consider how we can make this work, right? And I wonder if in future reforms, if it's really necessary to have exclusion grounds as penalties, right? One argument against that would be is that there's plenty of other penalties listed that competent authorities can apply. So fines, retraction of permits. So there's a list in every single one of them. And procurement and exclusion, temporary exclusion from procurement is only one of those penalties. So it's a discretionary penalty. So I wonder if it's really necessary to have it in there, right? But maybe, effectiveness studies will show that it's necessary. On top of that, we already have the voluntary exclusion ground in 57, which refers to 18.2, so 57A, which calls for the enforcement of environmental, social, and labor laws, right? So in general, most of the scope of this sectoral pieces of legislation could already be caught by that exclusion ground, right? So those would be two reflections on, I think, questioning why do we need those the penalty approach, right? Unfortunately, that doesn't help us now because we have them. But I think there's two things that are of importance, and one you already rightly note, I think, is the absolute vital aspect of coordination between contracting authorities that run public procurement procedures that work in the context of the more traditional exclusion grounds and the competent authorities on the national level that will apply those penalties. How will contracting authorities know about those penalties that have been applied? Is there a database, etc., etc.? One other aspect that I think could be of use is the question has come up is what do we do with those exclusion grounds? Do we need to implement them? Can we implement them? And one of the things that the Dutch approach has taken, and I know Hungary has also done the same, is to implement these new exclusion grounds within the system that we already have in national legislation, implementing 57. And what they've done there generally, if I reflect on the Netherlands or what they're trying to do, say for instance, for deforestation, a proposal has been tabled in which the exclusion ground from deforestation is implemented as a mandatory exclusion ground for contracting authorities, referring to the penalties that have been imposed by other competent authorities. I think the benefit of that is that there's some awareness. There is one list of exclusion grounds which contracting authorities can apply or not apply. Of course, that coordination aspect remains vital, but I think that's relevant to perhaps consider. One thing, though, is that ultimately, I do think that if it's a mandatory exclusion ground, there can be no self-cleaning or there can be no exemption based on reasons in the general interest. Because ultimately, what that would do is it would diminish the initial penalty. So if I would make the comparison, and I'll come to a close, is say you've infringed competition law. You pay your fine, and still you can be excluded based on an exclusion ground in the public procurement directives, because it's a different phase of an entity's life. So what would then happen is you would then, based on that, be able to self-clean by stating, I've paid my fines, I've implemented compliance schemes, I'm a better person, right? But that's different, I think, in the exclusion setting that we're in now, because we cannot touch that initial penalty. So that's why I would say, well, then it doesn't make sense to have self-cleaning or derogations based on the general interest. But I think it's about raising awareness and coordination. And I think maybe that a focus on national implementation, to have one list at least on the national level, could be of use here. But again, a very relevant reflection.
Okay, thank you very much. Yo también estoy de acuerdo con que hay que simplificar las prohibiciones de contratar, y creo que también me resulta muy complicado lo del doble sistema de prohibiciones de contratar automática y prohibiciones de contratar que vamos a evaluar o no. Ponen al órgano de contratación en una tesitura. Yo creo que o estás en una prohibición de contratar o no lo estás, ¿no? Ese sistema híbrido, quizás pensado para un momento de transición, complica más que otra cosa. Bueno, cerramos eso. Dos temas súper interesantes, importantísimos, lo de la vinculación del objeto del contrato nuclear. Si alguien quiere intervenir ahora, como esto es abierto, puede levantar la mano y hacerlo. Si no es así, I give the floor to my colleague, Raquel Carvalho, para que pregunte precisamente algo sobre el artículo 18, ¿no?
So much, Jimena, and thank you for the kind invitation. Good morning to all that are listening to us, and thank you, Wilhelm, for your report. It's very interesting and insightful. As Jimena has said, I have one question about Article 18. In your report, when you are assessing the importance of Article 18, besides considering that the article needs clarification regarding the appropriate measures, which I agree, and the adequate relations to other legislative instruments, do you consider that the regulation of deforestation and minimum wage, that's the examples you give, fall within the scope of that provision? Do you not consider that the future directives should clearly establish that the contracting authorities may only pursue horizontal policies beyond the scope of legal obligations, both national and EU union law? Even though I agree with you when you sustain that the need to implement the rules enshrined in Article 18, there is foreseen there's a principle, a norm principle. Principles are evidently mandatory, but their enforceability is very difficult. Thus, the article should be the ground of norm rules. Can the concretization be with the exemplification in other directives, in other regulations, sectorial ones? I agree that Article 18 has a substantial nature. That's my thought also, but that's the guiding rule for all contracting authorities, and it's beneath all particular rules concerning the horizontal policies. So should the horizontal policy be concrete in procedural documents, or should they be left only to specification in the procedural documents? Because in my view, contracting authorities have a place and a space to pursue horizontal policies when they are beyond compliance of mandatory rules. I would like very much to hear something more about this from you. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much for your kind question and your very useful reflections on what I think is one of the most complicated provisions in the public procurement directives. I sometimes also feel that a lot of the debate has been mostly academic and policy focused, and in practice, it's often seen as a tick in the box. And unfortunately, I don't know how effective it's been in practice, and I think that relates also to how big the scope is of this provision. It concerns collective bargaining agreements, national law, European law, international law, and then in the scope of environmental law, social law, labor law. And I think that maybe to return to a part of your question, I think all of those green and social acts will fall within the scope of Article 18.2. So that's where a key relationship between the public procurement directives and the biggest part, I think, of this sectoral development of new directives and regulations comes from. So I think what we need to address is how vague it is. And actually, I think maybe also be more realistic about how we can make it an effective obligation. And I think that would mean two things and then maybe a question. So let me start with the first. I think ultimately it means that I think we need to look at if we can't make that a direct obligation for contracting authorities. Now it refers to a legislative obligation for the member states that need to take appropriate measures. And I think if you look at the implementation in many member states, that has become a tick in the box of generally of the self-declaration very often. And I wonder if it's not more interesting to give rights to aggrieved bidders to also challenge the lack of enforcement here by making sure that national implementations cannot limit the effectiveness of this provision. So if I reflect on the Dutch implementation, my home jurisdiction, it just merely notes that, one, contracting authorities need to give interested parties in the contract the information about all of those laws, which between you and us here with the amount of 40 people that are here, they never give that information because they don't have the information. Also taking into account that the question can come up, is it also national law in Spain or is it only national law in the Netherlands? And on top of that, I think the second issue here is that the Dutch law only refers to they need to ensure that they comply. So how does that work? Is the tender, the interested party or the tenderer then just ticks a box and say, yeah, I comply with all of it. And then it's never touched again. There's not been any case law, there's not been any discussion about if that actually effectuates in practice. So I think that moving the scope or the norm addressee of it, so who is legislated there to contracting authorities might be of use here. And maybe one more reflection is, so you also noted the point, well, what does that mean? Should it just be technical specifications or all of it, right, in the performance of the contract? Well, I think the scope now is mostly relates to the contractual performance, that when you perform the contract, you are actually compliant with it. But I think for the procurement process, I think we still have this wide array of different elements of which are being legislated right now. So there's a sort of a disbalance there. And as a final comment, if we're very strict about stating the public procurement directives regulate how to buy, and the sectoral legislation does what to buy, then I think 18.2 doesn't really fit in that. Because 18.2 provides this vital link at the moment, right? And we could say, well, perhaps if the system is like this for now, we keep it. But if you're being very strict about that division, 18.2 as a very vague principle, perhaps doesn't have a place anymore in the public procurement directives. But I still see benefits also to keeping it, but then by strengthening it by focusing on contracting authorities, which is something that Olga Martin and Marta Anthoff and Roberto Caranta and I focused on in a report for the Greens already, so it's nothing new there. Yeah, I think that would be still a relevant recommendation that we did at the time for the European Parliament. But thank you so much, Raquel, for your reflections.
May I ask one more question with two sub-questions?
Sorry, yes, of course, you can, but remember that Professor Coach is waiting for...
Yes, of course, I will be, well, my questions will be rather simple to present. I don't know if the answers will be too. Well, linking that with a question that is being on my mind for quite some time, that's planning of contracting procedures. The planning phase in contracting procedures is not very developed in the directives, and I ask you if you, because you addressed that issue also in your report, do you consider that the planning of each public procurement procedure within the broader activity planning of the contracting authorities is an important instrument for the successful implementation of horizontal policies starting from Article 18, and if that would be beneficial to turn that phase mandatory, and linking that with the due diligence directive and the fulfillment from the economic operators, if the planning would help contracting economic operators to address and fulfill, whenever they are obliged to, the due diligence directive. Because I believe a useful and detailed planning will also benefit the evaluation and monitoring phase at public procurement procedures that will benefit in horizontal policies. Well, that's the shortest I could. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much. I will also try to be brief in my response, even though I agree it's not an easy question. I would say, so the directive only says something about preliminary market consultations, right, in Article 40, and it really says nothing. It just says you're allowed to do it. Now, I think why this has been quite a big debate so far is that if you move away, the further you move away from contracting, the closer you get to make or buy. And the closer you get to the decision about, are we going to make it? Are we going to ally, so work with other public authorities, or are we going to buy it on the market? And I think so far, the EU legislator has been very hesitant to impede on that discretion. But I do think that it's an important aspect to consider, mostly because this is really a black box, also in terms of litigation. And I think that well thought out public procurement procedures and conscious choices for either make, buy, or ally, and if it's buy, then a more sustainable buy, right? If you consciously make that call and plan for it, I do think that has very relevant effects on the procedure, but also on the contract phase. But I think that's a big topic to unpack, because it really leads to questions of competences, who can regulate, but also questions of where regulation is most effective and how much we're willing to give up. And in that sense, the further you move forward in the planning, where you enter more policy discussions often, it's the same debate about more regulation about the contract phase, which has also been a topic that you don't want to touch on the EU level. So I think both, but generally, I mean, that's when places get most excited also from a scholarship perspective, is, when it gets a bit more controversial. I do think it's a relevant point to take in mind, but maybe I think for a later date, we can continue that debate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, Professor Cosio, the floor is yours.
Gracias, Ximena, para la invitación y la ocasión de escuchar al profesor Jansen. Tengo su estudio aquí, trabajando sobre eso verdaderamente interesante, y ahora me gusta compartir una reflexiones, además aprovechando de la presencia del autor. Son tres preguntas que voy un poco comentando. Primera, ¿son realmente solo dos las macro categorías de normas europeas que integran la disciplina de contratación pública? El estudio divide los instrumentos jurídicos analizados en dos macrocategorías: instrumentos relativos a la contratación pública verde y social obligatoria, y los instrumentos relacionados con el comercio y la industria en el contexto global cambiante. Perfecto, comparto totalmente eso. Pero tú consideras que podrían existir también otras macrocategorías a tener en cuenta. Por ejemplo, pienso que hay fundamentos suficientes para hacer referencia también a una tercera macrocategoría que agrupe las normas europeas que pertenecen al ámbito de la tecnología, la transición digital, la ciberseguridad, el desarrollo de la tecnología mediante inteligencia artificial. Ya tenemos bastante como le AI Act, il Data Act, il Cyber Resilience Act, il Digital Service Act. No nacieron para el ámbito de la contratación pública, pero es la contratación pública quien debe aplicarlos. Si observo el marco normativo de mi país, Italia, puedo afirmar que no faltan normas relacionadas con la tecnología que ya hoy inciden en muchos aspectos de la disciplina de la contratación pública. Hoy la contratación pública europea no es solo verde, social o geopolítica, también, creo, pienso, es de forma inevitable tecnológica. Ignorar este pilastro significa quizá no comprender dónde se generan muchos de los nuevos requisitos que impactan y seguramente impactarán cada vez más en los contratos públicos. Esto es un primer punto que me ha surgido leyendo el estudio, que es realmente interesante. Y quiero también hacer una reflexión sobre la causa de la fragmentación del marco normativo. El estudio demuestra claramente y finalmente que el marco normativo europeo en materia de contratación pública se ha vuelto extremadamente fragmentado. Del análisis que has realizado se desprende que las nuevas normativas se han sucedido de forma turbulenta y poco coordinada, hasta el punto de que, como señalas, la búsqueda de coherencia regulatoria no ha sido un elemento totalmente, ha sido un elemento totalmente ignorado. Yo creo que puede resultar interesante preguntarse cuáles son las causas de esta fragmentación. Me parece, por ejemplo, que esta falta de visión de conjunto refleja ante de todo una carencia de visión unitaria por parte de quien, a nivel europeo, impulsa la acción legislativa, es decir, la Comisión Europea. Si compartimos esta interpretación, y de hecho en tu estudio señalas que los instrumentos sectoriales nacen cada uno dentro de una DG, una Dirección General de la Comisión distinta, significa que debemos pedir a la Comisión que se dote de capacidades y herramientas más eficaces para teorizar y aplicar una visión de conjunto que tú llamas un enfoque omnibus, y yo comparto absolutamente esta visión, capaz de orientar de forma coordinada las normativas sectoriales. En este sentido, podría proponerse la creación de una cabina de dirección europea en el seno de la Comisión, pero superpartes respecto de las distintas direcciones generales, con capacidad de filtrar ex ante todas las propuestas normativas que afectan, aunque sea de forma marginal, la disciplina de la contratación pública. En otras palabras, el trabajo que tú has realizado en este estudio debería haberse hecho antes de todas estas normativas sectoriales y de forma más decidida por quienes tienen el poder en la Unión Europea para elaborar las propuestas normativas. Parece que los numerosos instrumentos de evaluación de impacto de lo que dispone la Comisión Europea en el marco que llamamos Better Regulation Framework no ha funcionado de manera adecuada, o al menos no han sido suficientes para evitar la trampa de normas sectoriales que generan fragmentación y, como bien demuestras en el estudio, riesgos de incertidumbre jurídica.
Michele, ¿dejamos que
Dime.
responda estas dos?
Bien, hay una tercera que está muy
Vale,
conectada con esa, ¿eh?
vale, venga.
Y por eso,
Vale, ok.
sí, estoy pensando cómo cerrar un poco y llegar al punto. Eh, en el sector de la contratación, creo que es necesario, decimos, no sé cómo se dice en español, en italiano se dice tirar de las orejas a la comisión.
Igual.
Y recordarle su papel de coordinación de las políticas y de las normativas sectoriales. En cuanto a las soluciones, tu estudio ofrece algunas indicaciones. Comparto la recomendación según la cual es necesario considerar un enfoque ómnibus que permita modificar todos los instrumentos conforme a una lógica coordinada, con el fin de garantizar la coherencia del marco jurídico. Debemos evitar repetir los errores cometidos. Por eso subrayo la necesidad de una cabina de dirección super DG coherente con el principio de coordinación de políticas previsto en el artículo 7 del Tratado sobre el Funcionamiento de la Unión Europea. Ya está perfectamente marcado en el tratado. Solo así se evitará que cada sector produzca obligaciones aisladas que acaben desarticulando la disciplina de la contratación pública. Una tercera reflexión que está muy conectada con esa, lo siento, Ximena, pero así que el discurso tiene una línea. Eh, Creo que antes de poner mano a soluciones normativas, es fundamental definir los objetivos que queremos alcanzar. Por ejemplo, si aspiramos a una mayor simplificación y uniformidad del marco jurídico aplicable a la contratación pública, objetivo que me parece compartido también en la posición expresada en el Pleno del Parlamento del 9 de septiembre, que es bastante fragmentado en sus visiones, entonces es evidente que no podemos permitirnos mantener demasiadas opciones sectoriales sobre cómo comprar, sobre qué comprar, sobre a quién excluir, sobre qué excluir. En este sentido, un esfuerzo necesario es el de reconducir todas estas opciones sectoriales a dos o tres modelos normativos comunes que pueden estar presentes en las futuras normas europeas sobre contratación pública, y a estos modelos deberían remitir después las distintas normativas sectoriales. Ok, tengo otra reflexión sobre el tema de la profesionalización, pero quizás se puede presentar después. Gracias.
Thank you so much for your kind reflections and your thoughtful remarks. I'll run. I've been writing along, and let me first off make a remark of jealousy. I started studying this development in 2019 when the Green Deal came out, and then I quickly found out that the birthplace or the most advanced member state was Italy when it came to the criteri ambientali minimi, right? So the first member state to have really minimum environmental criteria that were so expansive. I mean, other member states such as Spain had them as well, but I think Italy is still the example of where procurement is still very much regulated, I think in quite a clear mandatory manner. But I mean, that's a whole different discussion also in terms of enforcement and what happens before the courts. So maybe for a follow-up. But to reflect on maybe also to move away from my jealousy about your comment about macro and the division or the two, I would say, main categories. I think it depends how you look at it. And I think there's reasons to also say, well, there's a third category. So I tend to agree and disagree with what you're reflected on. If you look at sort of technology and cybersecurity as a separate category, I think there's a good point to be made for that. The reason why I still included them also under trade and say industry perspectives is because that's often the reason why legislation was enacted, right? So even though we we now regulate say the construction and production of heat pumps, of wind turbines, of advanced net zero technologies, we regulate that also via the Net Zero Industry Act. I think one of the reasons why that came about wasn't necessarily because of solely technological aspects, but mostly for strategic autonomy and trade questions. So to amp up production in Europe. So I would say there is room to argue for three categories. The position that I chose was mostly why did these pieces of legislation come about? I think, though, say in a couple of years' time, should this development continue, right? Because at the moment, there's no reason to suggest why we would not have more pieces of legislation, including this approach, right? So we have, say, 62 now, or some pending, but more than 50 adopted. I don't see a reason why, other than us in this call and the reports that have been written flagging this, why we wouldn't be able to have more legislative instruments adopted. So let's see what happens there, but I think that's about related to the macro elements. And then I think to your useful point also, when it comes to policy coherence or policy coherence within the European Commission, I think that's also something that, and I can't reflect on all the member states, but I've heard very similar scenarios about what happened also when these legislative acts came out. So if I reflect on the Netherlands, and how that also works in silos in policy making on the national government. The Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs is responsible for the Public Procurement Act, which implements the public procurement directives. It took a long time to get coordination going between the different ministries, because a lot of the energy related aspects or environmental aspects landed in agriculture, in the Ministry for Agriculture, or the Ministry for the Interior, who dealt with digital affairs. So the point that you, I think, rightly made, discussing coherence and cooperation within the European Commission, I think same goes also for the national member states. And I think there it would be very useful to sort of look at mainstreaming cooperation there to ensure that at least when we continue with new acts, the same issue doesn't arise. And I think then a body that you suggested, I think, is at least a logical step forward. But I think I would agree with your third point where you note, well, we can have a body like that, but we need to think about why we regulate, because otherwise this body wouldn't be able to have the procurement compass that I talked about before. And then maybe to build off your comment, or to build on top of your comment, I wonder if we could make categories, right? Us academics, our job is to provide legal certainty, but also to categorize in a great sense, right? So I wonder, could we say that, say, cybersecurity and security aspects are always relevant for any procurement? And I'm thinking out loud right now, right? Just to categorize. So say maybe those objectives, they would need to be put in every procurement. But maybe environmental is more relevant for one category, and maybe social is more relevant for another. So say for works construction, maybe a local procurement in that sense. So I think in that sense, one, I agree, we need to have a clearer view on why we regulate, because now we regulate for a great number of reasons, right? We do it for energy efficiency, circular economy, market integration, strategic autonomy, all these types of, and the list goes on. So I think we would need to think about, and I'll leave that as a last point, is from the perspective of a public buyer, buying on the ground, they would need to work with two sets of objectives. The ones that are in voluntary procurement policy of the body buying, and they would need to take into account obligations in the law. And I think if we start there and we start looking at how that works out in specific tenders, we could say something about the approach that would be relevant also on a broader, more macro level if we scale that up. But this is, I think, a very tricky balance to be able to identify what should be the objective of European procurement legislation. And if we can identify that, is there a certain hierarchy between those objectives, some that apply all the time and others that are relevant in certain scenarios? But that's, I think, a topic for a whole other webinar. But I'll leave it at that. And thank you so much for your reflections.
Okay, thank you very much, Willem. No sé si hay alguien que quiera en este momento hacer alguna pregunta de los que están que no están en el panel, dijéramos, pero que quisieran comentar algo, preguntarle algo a profesor Jensen. No sé, Ana Oliva, ¿no? ¿Ha encendido la cámara?
¿Qué tal?
Hola, Ana.
Espera, no sé si se me oye.
¿Se escucha? No, ¿sería posible que te presentaras?
Sí, por
Ya.
supuesto.
Gracias.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Yo soy Ana Oliva, trabajo en el Tribunal de Recursos Contractuales de Cataluña, en el catalán. Bueno, por motivos académicos siempre me ha parecido muy interesante la figura esta del self-cleaning. De hecho, estuve estudiándolo, no por temas profesionales, puramente interés personal, académico, de dónde venía, si había algún antecedente a nivel regulatorio en el marco de la Unión Europea. Y también estuve estudiando toda la jurisprudencia, todo lo que es lo del TJUE al respecto, para ver si podía de alguna forma extraer pues un poquito una línea cronológica, ¿no? O una evolución de dónde salió y con qué finalidad, básicamente. Entonces, mi pregunta va a ser de este tema estrictamente. En concreto, se ha mencionado, yo creo que por parte del Ayuntamiento de Madrid, la opción, y en respuesta a Willem, la opción de regular alguna base de datos, ¿no? De al final licitadores excluidos, por el motivo que sea directamente excluidos o por existencia de una causa que motiva su exclusión, pues o en la existencia de una infracción
Vale.
declarada, ¿no? De una sentencia, etc. Hemos visto también en el TJUE, ha habido un par de casos, por ejemplo, en el caso de Lituania, que existe allí en su legislación nacional una base de datos. Y de hecho, en los reglamentos financieros, la parte de contratación pública que regulan por parte de las instituciones públicas ya contienen desde 2012 sobre todo, pero previamente ya contenían esta previsión, una base de datos, ¿no? Para que puedas acudir ahí tú, poder adjudicador, y no tengas que ir buscando con múltiples autoridades, sean
Vale.
de competencia laboral, etc. La pregunta es la siguiente. Teniendo en cuenta el sistema actual de regulación de la contratación pública mediante directivas europeas, que por tanto la parte de transposición no se puede esquivar, y tienen que determinar en consecuencia pues un mínimo, ¿no? Una regulación mínima, y teniendo también en cuenta el factor de la self-cleaning, que veo que no va a desaparecer como mínimo.
Ana, perdona, que vamos súper mal de tiempo, pues hay otras personas que también quieren intervenir. ¿Puedes formular la pregunta? Gracias.
Sí, es decir, dos factores que motivan mi pregunta. La primera, el tipo de regulación a nivel europeo, las directivas, y la segunda,
Vale.
la figura self-cleaning, que obviamente pone bastante en peligro la seguridad jurídica si se deja al arbitrio
Vale.
o discreción de cada órgano de contratación decidir si un licitador está rehabilitado o no.
Gracias.
Y por tanto, la
Gracias,
pregunta
Ana.
es, ¿la base de datos que se pueda crear, con qué ámbito territorial cree que se puede hacer? ¿Ámbito europeo estamos hablando? ¿Ámbito nacional? ¿Qué margen cree usted que se podría dar ahí?
Gracias.
Gracias.
Perdona, Willem, creo que Javier Serrano, que también es de un tribunal, quiere intervenir. Es así, lo digo por concentrar, disculpa, ¿eh? Tú nos dices cuando. Gracias, Javier.
Sí, bueno,
Estamos
gracias.
viendo tu ordenador, que no pasa nada, ¿eh?
Sí,
Pero
sí, estoy haciendo así cosas raras. Ya está. Bueno, gracias, Ximena, por organizar este festejo y gracias al profesor Jansen por su trabajo y por su intervención hoy. A mí me ha llamado la atención, por deformación profesional, yo trabajo en un órgano de recursos contractuales, igual que mi compañera Ana, yo en el de Euskadi. Entonces, he visto que uno de los puntos es aclarar el ámbito de aplicación de la directiva de recursos para que incluyan los demás instrumentos legislativos, ¿no? Entonces, a mí me ha recordado a un debate no muy crudo, pero bueno, que en algunos momentos ha surgido entre los tribunales de recursos contractuales, pensando que había una postura, vamos a decir, más reducida de estimar que el ámbito del recurso especial se delimita por el sector del ordenamiento jurídico sobre el que puede tratar. Es decir, lo nuestro es la legalidad contractual y no la legalidad no contractual, ¿no? Nosotros, por ejemplo, tuvimos muy crudo ese debate cuando tuvimos que resolver un recurso planteado, en este caso era por un sindicato que alegaba un convenio colectivo que limitaba la externalización de servicios, limitaba la misma potestad de contratar, entonces impugnaba un contrato de servicios que iba contra el convenio colectivo. Entonces yo recuerdo que algunos compañeros nos decían aquello de no os metáis en política, ¿no? Esto es una cuestión de las relaciones sindicales que las resuelvan los sindicatos con los empresarios que son poderes adjudicadores. Bueno, nosotros en ese caso tomamos una posición distinta que la confirmó nuestro Tribunal Superior de Justicia, de entender que el recurso especial, que es como llamamos en España al recurso de la directiva de recursos, es un recurso administrativo especial por el procedimiento y por el ámbito, es la contratación pública, pero no por el ordenamiento jurídico, por la legalidad que aplica. Es un trabajo, es un control integral. Y de hecho, sin quererlo, yo creo que este debate está zanjado por la realidad, ¿no? Todos los días hablamos en recursos especiales, yo qué sé, de los códigos de construcción, del reglamento de baja tensión o del reglamento de transportes, que no son propiamente legalidad contractual. Entonces, yo quería preguntarle al profesor Jansen si podría ampliar un poco este punto 10, lo de la directiva lo de ampliar el ámbito de la directiva de recursos, si cree y si cree que sería suficiente con decir, bueno, pues que el recurso de la directiva es un recurso de legalidad integral y que no puede disminuir ese recurso las garantías que da cualquier recurso ordinario en los países que transpongan la directiva o en su día que apliquen el reglamento. En fin, si nos podría comentar un
Gracias.
poco exactamente en qué fórmula jurídica está pensando. Aunque
Gracias, Javi.
yo creo que en España lo tenemos relativamente resuelto.
Muchísimas gracias, Javi. No sé si Vanessa quería hacer alguna pregunta. ¿Quieres comentar algo, Vanessa, ahora? O calla para siempre, porque ya estamos en tiempo de descuento y si no le daría... Vanessa, ¿quieres preguntar?
Sí.
Hola.
Hola, buenos días, Jimena. No, por mi parte no tengo preguntas. Tuvimos la oportunidad de tener
Vale.
desde todos los expertos de contratación pública de los distintos Estados miembros, tuvimos una bilateral con William y el informe es suficientemente explícito y sí que
Vale.
quiero agradecer el debate. Gracias.
Gracias, Vanessa. Entonces, Ana Belén, cerrarías tú, si quieres.
Well, good morning again. First of all, I want to thank you for your great and wonderful presentation. A lot of the topics that I would have liked to ask you about have already been brought to the table, so I'm not going to be very long. I would like, however, to draw up a suggestion. As he said, I think we need another workshop because there is still much to be debated, and I had some specific preoccupations or topics that worried me in the sense of simplification, everything that we've just talked about. And then at the same time, we're talking about simplifying. And we have to think that in practice, who's going to work with these directives, regulations, and national legislation are going to be public workers, many times working for small contracting bodies that do not have specific knowledge, and the regulation is becoming more and more complex. To a point where the coordination is the key word that you said ever since the beginning. And I want to thank you for that and for bringing that up to the attention, because these regulations are complex, but then they're going to be further developed and delved into by national legislation, and it's going to become a huge forest that we need to navigate. In any sense, thank you both for the organization, for your intervention, for the paper, of course. And suggestion, a new workshop, please. It would be great for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Noel. Professor Jansen?
Yes, thank you so much. Lots of questions. I will try to be brief. I think all of them are very relevant. Maybe first off, the database related to for self-cleaning. Well, I think first off, there's always, I think, a bit of a tricky issue with if a database can actually coexist with self-cleaning. I think there's an issue there of blacklisting, of naming and shaming, right? And on top of that, I think in general, I don't want to paint things with a broad brush, but maybe I am about to. Governments have been pretty bad in the past at updating these lists. Right, so the information in the database is also useful if it's actually accurate and current, right? And I think so more on a practical level, I think it would be useful to have such a database on the EU-wide level, but I don't see how that's going to work from a technological perspective, from a practical perspective, right? So maybe then to start off first on a national level, that would make a lot more sense. When it comes to the remedies directive, the relation to the second question that was posed, I think this requires more research. I think this requires more research, and that's also what I've tried to highlight in the report as well, is that some of the legislative acts refer to the procurement directives. And one could then argue, well, because they refer to the procurement directives, the remedies directives remedy is also relevant. If you look at it from a different way, and you look at Article 1 of the Remedies Directive, it refers to community law in the field of public procurement, or national rules transposing that law. And so the question is this an issue even? Because based on that, if you take a broad concept of what procurement law is, all of these provisions would already fall within its scope. The International Procurement Instrument, the Clean Vehicles Directives, definitely, because they focus solely on procurement. But I think there's also a case to be made is that the eco-design regulation, even though it only has one provision on procurement, that's still procurement law. Some might differ on this, right? Some might say, well, that's environmental law with a procurement angle. Then, if that is the case, I do think we need to change the remedies directives to say explicitly that even though procurement isn't in the name of an act, it needs to be included there. And I think the relevant point of what does that mean for national remedies and the relation to what is in the directive, I think that calls for more research. I tried to at least highlight that in one of the footnotes, but I think that's a beautiful PhD project to look at the differences between redress options in the national level and those in the remedies directive. And then maybe as a response to the final question, other than that, I agree that we need another webinar. I'd love to join another one, but maybe with another speaker on the other reports. I don't know what Professor Ximena has in mind. But I think there's a big issue with words like flexible and simplify, because no one understands what that means. Everyone agrees with simpler rules and more flexible rules, but I think a lot it's being used as a means to do basically what people believe in, right? And in that sense, I also don't understand, and economists and competition lawyers are also struggling with this. What does this need for competitiveness mean? Because it's not competition. Competitiveness seems to basically be more of a political rhetoric of cutting red tape, less rules. But if we know anything from competition, more rules are generally good for competition because it creates clear conditions, it solves market failures. So in that sense, and I also wonder if we need more competition. And a colleague of mine, Professor Elisabetta Manunzes, argued very rightly also in the Dutch Senate in stating, maybe we just need better competition and not more, right? Maybe we just need competition between two green, really good bidders, and not need 15 low budget, bad for the environment bids, right? But so that's more of a terminology type of thing. Whereas I think those things like how do we define flexible, simplify, competitiveness, competition? I think there's also, I don't want to create 5 webinars, but I think that's those are relevant questions to ask for the future, I think.
Muy bien, thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias, Willem, por tu presencia aquí con nosotros, por facilitar estos espacios de aprendizaje colectivos, también a quienes nos han acompañado, a Miquel, a Raquel, a Begoña, a Anabel, bueno, a todos los que están aquí y que han aportado una visión para que podamos entender, porque esta es una realidad realmente muy compleja que nos importa a todos y es importante conocerla. Y nada, pues nos despedimos hasta la próxima oportunidad. Muchas gracias, Willem. Nosotros también te recordamos mucho en tu visita en Alcalá, a ver si podemos invitarte nuevamente. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Willem.
Thank you so much.